The second main voice of the late Baroque period was George Frederick Handel. Lived basically the same time period as Bach from 1685, born the same year. Lived a couple years later, and he found most of his fame in England as his career developed. He moved over there and had great success with operas and especially oratorios that we'll talk about later. He was more of a commercially focused artist versus Bach was more of the kind of sacred music focused. Bach was focused on writing music for his church, the Lutheran Church, and delving into the possibilities that were there and developing the compositional styles available to us through that music. Versus Handel, again, he was more of a commercial artist. He was selling, writing his music for the music loving public of the day. And during the Baroque period, as is still popular today, we crave new music. So he was always striving to put out something new and exciting for the public to enjoy. So let's give you an overview of his career to see how he got from Germany to England. He was born in Germany. His father was a barber and a surgeon and had no love for music whatsoever. His child, George Frederick Handel, showed some interest in kind of prodigies type skill towards the instruments at a young age, and eventually a music teacher in their town convinced Handel's father to let him take lessons, and begrudgingly he let it happen. Down the road to fulfill his father's wishes, Handel did go to law school. He studied law and actually worked as a lawyer for a couple years before turning his interest back towards music, where his first main musical job was being the second violinist in the Hamburg Opera. And he was there for about 10 years. He filled in as keyboardist as necessary, showed off his abilities with the keyboard, and eventually he moved to Florence, Italy. And in Italy, he absorbed the Italian opera style, wrote one of his own, Le Resurrezione, and that became an international success, and he had fame throughout all of Europe at that time. A couple years later, he decided to move back to Germany, Hanover, Germany specifically, and was the Kapellmeister there for several years, and was given the leniency and freedom to create any music he wanted, and also he was allowed to basically take leaves, kind of like a sabbatical, and head off to England for a while to uh, perform for the Queen of England and also write some music for her as well. When he got to England, uh, Queen Anne of England, who was in power at the time, she loved his music, and she wanted him to stay there as her court composer. Of course, at some point, Handel did need to go back and uh, back to his standard post back in Germany. But as luck would have it, the storyline kind of intertwined at that point where once Queen Anne passed away, the new king to come into power in England was King George, who happened to be Handel's boss back in Hanover, Germany. So a little awkward situation at first, but they came to terms with it. They were all cool and everything was fine, hunky dory. So Handel had his freedom and his ability to stay in England and compose operas and music for the king, King George. One of the pieces we'll listen to, Water Music, is dedicated to King George. So while in England, he became the director, basically created an opera company. They called it the Royal Academy of Music. And it had some success for a while until basically the idea of Italian opera fell out of favor with the English music public, and they just wanted something different. So at that time, Handel kept writing, working with his operas. They just weren't selling, so he had to turn his focus towards another avenue to find basically his success, his money, his fame, his fortune. And that's when he turned his compositional techniques towards oratorios, which are they're basically an opera style drama, but they're focused on a biblical text and they don't have any of the extra stage craft of operas. None of the big costumes or sets and designs of any sort. It's really just the music, the concert of the music with the storyline of the text behind it. It was set in English as well versus being Italian operas was sung in Italian. So, of course, the English listening public enjoyed listening to English a little bit easier, as you can imagine. And down this road, this is where Handel had his greatest success, especially with his oratorio Messiah, which you're probably familiar with the Hallelujah chorus, if nothing else, from it. So, talking about Handel's music itself, he wrote a great deal of music, basically in all the musical styles. He wrote instrumental music. He wrote dance suites, concertos, concerto grosso as well. But the core of his music, as I've mentioned before, was writing Italian operas and then later on the oratorios. He wrote close to 40 operas. None of it was specifically church music. It was all, like I said, commercial music or more secular music for the paying public to be entertained. So that kind of shows in the quality of his music. There's always a comfortable setting of it, shall we say. So musically, part of this commercial style that he had, very simple, concise melodies, easy to latch on to, connect with, very conventional harmonies, nothing really out there or tense, dissonant, very standard cadences, all the basic stuff, the meat and potatoes that everybody loves to hear. I definitely favored more of a homophonic setting versus the polyphonic. And again, going back to the opera style, they kind of put the homophonic nature of music to the forefront, and when they realized and said, hey, everybody, we can grab onto one single melody sung by one singer at a time, much easier than we can hear all this crazy polyphony that we heard back in the madrigal days. And so, as you can imagine, with the pop appeal, the popular appeal of his music, at some point it kind of became predictable. But the cool thing, the strength of Handel was that he could take this predictability but make it interesting and exciting at the same time versus just being boilerplate kind of music that just shoved out there in the world. A couple of the ideas that he'd like to work with over the development of his music are these. He'd often take two separate melodies and eventually later on down the road in say like his oratorios or his operas, combine them in a polyphonic setting so he creates that interest and that connection between the two. His moods in his music, he would often move from a major key to a minor key, from like a brighter sound to a darker sound, happier to sad sound, however you want to look at it. And all of this was meant to help reinforce the text of the piece, the opera, the oratorio, what have you. And a lot of times he would break from, say, using polyphony into a series of chords. And this would go from the more, say, tense polyphonic setting to that kind of homogenized chord sound where everybody can grab together and kind of link together in the music. It has the big kind of chorus effect to it, shall we say. Like most composers of the Baroque time period, Handel's music is strongly based in the idea of the doctrine of the affections, where you have a common mood between pieces across a single piece, but more so even deeper into the doctrine of the affections, where certain musical gestures, certain musical keys denote a specific emotional response from them. where certain keys, say like D major, is meant to be more of a pleasant pastoral sound, or B minor, very tense, dark kind of sound to it. Very specific prescribed emotions come from these certain keys during the time period. His music also very, very strongly based in word painting, which makes perfect sense since he's writing opera and oratorios, that his melodies really are shaped and imitate the words that are being sung from. And this all built into these climactic choruses, the Hallelujah chorus from Messiah being a prime example of it. So let's take a minute to get to know the oratorio a little bit better. The oratorio itself is one of the biggest developments in music in the late Baroque period. It's basically one of the children of opera. So you had opera, you had the big drama, the big music, the big just overall performance, costumes, stagecraft, etc. Then in the Lutheran Church, you had the development of the cantata, favored by Bach. And it took all the elements and the structure of opera and associated it with the worship within the Lutheran Church. So you had all your arias, your recitatives, your choruses, some acting involved, costumes, but it was all in portraying the sermon and the worship service of the Lutheran Church at the time, and had that very specific story in it. Then you have the oratorio. And the oratorio takes biblical texts and stories and puts it in a concert hall. So the biggest difference between an opera and an oratorio, though, is that there's none of the costumes, the acting, the staging, any of that stuff. It's just purely a musical experience. It's a music concert with the elements and songs like an opera. You have arias, you have recitatives, you have your choruses, etc., but none of the acting, none of the big costumes, none of the stagecraft. It's just purely music for enjoyment, for entertainment purposes. And as you can imagine, with the biblical text, the sacred text of it, there were some critics, obviously, who felt it was a little sacrilegious to have a sacred text used for pure entertainment purposes. We've seen that in other movies and such since then as well. So a couple of characteristics of oratorio that might be different than, say, opera, and Handel was very fond of these ideas as well. Well, recitatives, as always, they are there to narrate the story, to push the story along, but they're more so used in connecting the transitions between scenes a little bit better than, say, an opera. It might just be this scene is one recitative, the next scene is another recitative, an aria in between, maybe, who knows. The biggest difference musically is that the choruses were much more important. They were more of the climactic parts of an oratorio, where everybody involved could comment and participate on the action and story that's being told to us. So, of course, one of the biggest, best examples of an oratorio is Handel's Messiah. You've probably heard the chorus for this piece many a time. It's played just about every year during the holidays, around Christmas, etc. And it's served many people for wonderful entertainment for many hundreds of years now. So the piece itself, it's 2.5 hours long, and astonishingly, Handel wrote this in 24 days. He had these bits of kind of spurts of creativity, which some musicologists, etc., associate with possibly being bipolar or manic depressive. That's just pure conjecture, but interesting side note nonetheless. The Messiah, 2.5 hours long, written in 24 days. and it's focused on the Christian text in a concert hall. No big theater behind it, just pure music. Handel wrote it more so in the terms of being a meditation on the religious ideas, not a superbly dramatic quality to it at all. There are no specific plots or actors or characters within the entirety of the work. It's just more generalized meditation on the storyline. And this is kind of a brief synopsis of it. It's in three parts, three acts. The first part is the prophecy of the Messiah's coming, the announcement of Christ's birth, and the redemption of humanity through his appearance. The second part is the redemption by the sacrifice of Christ, man's rejection of God's offer, and then man's defeat when trying to oppose the Almighty. And then the third act is where man expresses his faith and certainty to the eternal life of Christ and the higher power, and so on. And it's in this third act that we hear the big hallelujah chorus that you guys all know. So, that's an oratorio.